Hi, Caroline.
Hello, how are
Hi,
you?
I'm doing so well. I don't know if you remember, you interviewed me at the
I
beginning of
do.
2020.
I
And
missed
I
such a
want to
long
tell you what a
time.
class act you are because I got a note from you thanking me for being on your podcast. And I thought to myself, I kept the note for months.
Oh,
And I mean, you did me the favor. My gosh. I mean, I was so appreciative and still am. I got a big bump that after it was published. So
good. I'm so pleased. Well, people loved the interview, and it really, it's you spoke to people, so it was really great. So
well, thank you
thank you.
so much.
It's lovely to see you again. I mean, it's what.
Yes, to you too. To you too. I'm in my home studio because of COVID.
Yes.
So yeah. So anyway, I'm delighted to have you. I was telling Mac, I have read your book cover to cover. I have 9 pages of notes.
Oh my goodness. I'm very honored.
And
Thank you.
I even missed the Arkansas, Texas tailgate.
I'm so, I'm so, you're talking about this book, the
Yes,
latest.
that's the one that I read. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. That's
You're
really
so welcome. My husband had his, I didn't want to go to the game because of COVID, but the tailgate might have been. So my husband went by himself, and he goes, "I can't believe you're reading that book." I said,
watching. It's so funny. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I love it. I love it.
well,
Well,
I will do an intro. I know I don't want to take up too much of your time. I will do an intro before, so you don't have to sit here and listen to me talk about
no,
you.
that's fine.
Can you hear me all right? Are you?
Yes, it's great. And is the sound okay? Did you need me to put my earphones in, or is the sound good?
Yeah, I think it's good. I think it's good. Yeah, that's
Fantastic.
fine.
That's wonderful. And then I unfortunately have a hard out at like 5 to 11 or so because we're catching a
Oh,
flight to Miami. Is that okay? How long do you normally go
sure.
with
No,
the
no,
podcast?
no. I go about 45 minutes, 40, something
Perfect.
like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
perfect. Well, then
yeah.
that will be done by sort of 10 to then. That's
Some of the
wonderful.
book I think is probably, I mean, I'm not down in my listenership, but I was struggling to remember frontal alpha, whatever. I mean, some of it is kind of symmetry. So some of it was like, whoa, I need to read this again to understand it fully.
It's that
So,
kind of book, people can skip past those sciencey parts and go straight to the practical, but I always put that in because then people know it's coming from a solid base.
oh,
So
it was fascinating. Okay, so John, my audio engineer, we're cutting to the chase and going to the interview.
wonderful.
Thank you, Caroline, so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, you were so kind to have me on in January or something like that of 2020, and I'm delighted to have you as my guest here at SelfWork.
I'm delighted to be with you. So thank you, Margaret. It's wonderful.
Sure.
It
I
was a
told you a
great.
few minutes ago. I'm sorry, what?
I loved our interview that I did with you on my podcast. It went down really well. It was a great discussion.
Oh, good. Well, thank you very much. The book's done pretty well. So
Oh,
I want the listeners of SelfWork to get to know you just a little bit. I think it's amazing that in a field where I'm sure it's very male dominated, that's what you chose to do. And it's interesting that you have the marriage of being a neuroscientist as well as being a clinician. And I would love to hear more about that.
absolutely. And it is. It really was. It was and still is a bit of a man's world when it comes to science, and especially when it comes to neuroscience. And, it started out with 38 years ago with one of my neuroscience lecturers actually saying the brain can't change. And at that stage, they still spoke about the mind and the brain being separate, whereas today they kind of speak about it as the same thing when it is separate. But it was, and back in the 80s, they believed that the brain could change. And it was that lecture, I remember that lecture so clearly. And I remember saying, I don't agree with that. It can't be. Our life is changing all the time. So our mind shows up in our brain, and therefore our brain is changing. So he said, well, go ahead and do research. And I said, I'm going to give me the most challenging population. And I started working with traumatic brain injury because that was considered to be they said, there was very little research on people with traumatic brain injury because they believed that, well, if the brain's damaged, why bother working with the brain?
Oh,
Now,
wow.
that's terrible. I mean, and as a clinician, we were being trained to teach patients to compensate and, to bring in the clinical neuroscience, but from a compensatory perspective. And I thought, something's wrong here. Anyway, fast forward 38 years. Well,
Now, this was I don't mean to interrupt you, but this was in South Africa, right?
in South Africa in the late 80s and early 90s. And so I did some of the first neuroplasticity research in my field, where I showed that with directed mind inputs, you can actually change a person's social, emotional, cognitive, and intellectual functioning and change the brain. And it was unheard of in that kind of field. And so it was a great start to really propelling me forward into realizing, well, boy, if we can do this without, I had patients that were written off as vegetables by neurologists. I mean, that's how they used to speak in those days. Thank goodness they don't speak like that anymore. Well, if they do, they won't do it around me. And that person, those kind of patients going on to get degrees and, change their lives. And it didn't happen once, it happened multiple times. And that's when I started realizing, when we can understand our mind and we can understand how we function, we can improve how we function on every level. So I was working with dementia and Alzheimer's, learning disabilities, trauma, everything. And it was a man's world. I was challenged everywhere. And, I was in communication pathology, but in a clinical neuroscientific environment. So it was kind of a blend of the two. And it was a 7-year degree that they put into 2 years, and we did part medicine. And at the time it was a nightmare because we worked 7 days a week. You can imagine doing it was an experimental group, 7 years put into 4 years. Now it's split back into 2 different degrees. But I'm so glad I did it because it propelled me into my master's, my PhD, continuing in clinical neuroscience. And then when I practiced for 25 years, I brought in the clinical neuroscience into the communication pathology, blended them, and continued researching at the same time. And fast forward to now I write books and do podcasts and lecture around the world and have apps and teach people how to manage their mind. And that's where it's gone to.
One of my favorite quotes, Caroline, was it's one of your shorter ones. You said, "You're not a broken or defective brain." Yeah. I loved that quote because it's a really strong melody. To me, it meant that you were giving a strong message. To me, you were giving a strong message about challenging the medical model of mental illness. And I just thought it reminded me a little bit of a seminar that I heard of Bessel van der Kolk. And it also reminded me a little bit of Dan Siegel's work, Name it to tame it, I think is his kind of catchphrase. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. And I really appreciate it. I've got a couple of models here. So for your listeners, I'm holding up a model brain.
Oh, okay.
And I always do this because when people see this, what I want to say is that you're not your brain, that your brain is something that your mind shows up in. And your brain is extremely complex, but it is always changing. It's never the same. It's the structure of your brain is moment by moment of every day is different. And that's something that we can drive. It's happening anyway, but if we don't drive it, it will go all over the place and become very messy. But if we actually drive that, and when I say we drive that with our mind, we can then change the structure of the brain in a direction that's more healthy. So that's neuroplasticity, the ability of us to change our brain. So the reason I put that...
Can you repeat that again? Neuroplasticity is?
Neuroplasticity is the fact that the mind can change the brain. The fact that the brain is not fixed. It's changeable. Can't change on its own, and that's really important. You can, if I had a dead person next to me and I was holding up a dead brain, the brain wouldn't do anything. But you and I now, if I linked us both up, set us up on a QEEG or an fMRI, we would see a lot of activity in our brain because we're alive. So what is the difference between a dead brain and an alive brain? A live person is using their mind. So mind is a very real thing, and mind shows up in the brain, and mind activates the brain to change. So a dead brain will do no changing, just going to disintegrate. But an alive brain, in a person who's alive, is constantly changing. So based on that concept, we need to then have another narrative around mental health, because over the last 40 years, I've watched the trajectory where we've gone from mental health's always been badly handled. I mean, that we do know. There's been periods in history where it's been okay. But we were going through a pretty good period in the 80s where we saw the mind and the brain as separate, and we looked at the narrative of the person. And we had more team approaches to dealing with issues, as opposed to now, which is, as we got more neuroscientific, we became very neuroreductionistic and all around brain. And neuroscience became, everything was the brain-based learning,
structures,
biomedical model. And so suddenly now, in order for the whole concept of people battling with life became a medical thing, And so it became like cancer and diabetes, as you know, that whole history. And so people still today will talk about, oh, well, you treat your diabetes or you treat a broken arm, therefore you must treat your mental illness in the same way. But they're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you do a disservice to the person and to what the person is going through. And so the current model says that, well, you are depressed, you have clinical depression because of X, Y, and Z symptom. And then if you say, well, why have I got those symptoms? Because you've got clinical depression. Well, why do you know I've got clinical depression? Because of those symptoms. It's called a tautology. And then the whole thing that will come past that, after that, will be, well, it's in your brain. Your brain made you do it. So your brain gene, the genetic functionality of your brain's wrong. There's something wrong with your brain, because they've spent billions trying to map people's emotions onto the brain, which has been a pointless exercise. You can't do that because you're all so different. Mm-hmm. So, and your brain is responding as a whole organ all the time. So what they're saying now is that, okay, if you've got mental illness, you've got a broken brain. So therefore, and you've got broken neurotransmitters, and you've got, well, disturbed neurotransmitters, and you're missing something. You're missing some serotonin. There's no science behind that. It's just all a lot of
theory.
Research, saying that, okay, well, if the brain seems to respond. So what we've done is we've taken a beautiful concept, which is us as humans are thinking, feeling, and choosing. We're using our mind. We're responding to life. And with technology, we can actually see the response in the brain. You can't see thought, but you can see the brain doing something.
I have to tell you that just as a clinician and knowing so well what you call the non-conscious mind, I've always called it unconscious, but I loved your distinction between, it's you're unconscious when you're under anesthesia or something like that, or when you're dead, I guess.
Exactly.
But the non-conscious, I even started using it myself. I thought, wow, that's a great concept. But anyway, the fact that you can see on what you call a QEEG, which I think you probably need to explain to people what that is. I kind of know, but that you can see the non-conscious mind. You can see it.
Unreal.
I was just fascinated. In fact, I have to say to you, I've closed your book and I thought, in my next life, I want to come back as a neuroscientist because I would love to actually watch that.
It's phenomenal to see the action that someone, as I always say, if someone's dead, there's no action. But when someone's alive, we see changes in blood flow. We see changes in oxygen. We see changes in the energy frequencies. So the mind is showing up in the brain and the brain is responding. So what you're picking up with technology is simply the response of the brain. So it's not that you have a broken brain if you're battling with mental issues, is that if you have an adverse circumstance, you experience it with your mind. It shows up in your brain because we use our brain to be able to actually store that experience in a way that we can then speak about it and experience it. So we need our brain and our body for our mind to work through. But a brain and a body need the mind for it to actually do anything. So if you look at our psychoneurobiology, so I study psychoneurobiology, mind-brain-body connection, as opposed to just mind-body connection or mind-brain connection, mind-brain-body. So when we talk about the non-conscious mind, hang on, there were three questions. The first thing is that you're not a broken brain, because when you have an adverse circumstance, that experience is processed through your mind into your brain, and then it changes the brain. The brain responds on a structural level because of the genetic changes that will happen, because of the energy frequencies that it stimulates. So the simplest way, then I'll come into what the QEEG is. I'm going to show you two trees. Okay, so here's a little healthy green tree.
Oh, y'all should see this. It's a real tree she's holding up.
And that's what thoughts look like. So when we talk about the brain changing and experiences growing in the brain, I'm talking about you growing trees. As you're listening to me now, our mind, our ability to think and feel and choose, which is also an energy force around us and through us. When someone dies, they weigh less because that energy actually goes. So that energy force is through us giving the brain life. So that force on a psychological level is thinking, feeling, and choosing. And that's what you're using to process what I'm saying. You're thinking, feeling, and choosing at 400 billion actions plus a second.
Now, can you say that again? Because that's another astounding fact in the book.
Right, it's actually more. It's about 400 billion actions per second. It's more close.
It's incredible.
to 10 to the 27, which is just an unfathomable number. So I always say 400 billion. But what we're doing at the moment, all of us, is we are thinking, feeling, and choosing at these speeds, in these cycles, taking the stuff that we're saying, making sense of it, and it's all energy, pushing it into the brain. The brain is then responding on an electrical, electromagnetic, neurochemical, and genetic level. And when it does all that, it makes stuff. And the stuff it makes are proteins. And the proteins hold our words as vibrations. And the more words we say, the more proteins grow and the more branches grow. So these branches are holding the data of what we're saying. So these branches are memories. And the interesting thing about this thought is that it's got, like a tree's got a root and you've got branches. What we're saying is in the roots, because that's the source. And your interpretation, because we all have our own unique perception, our own unique way.
You say the roots are actually the non-conscious mind, right?
No, the roots, there's all in the non-conscious and conscious. So it's
okay.
all in.
Okay.
So it just think of the structure first, and I'll explain the non-conscious. So think of the structure first. This is happening. The non-conscious works 24/7. So our non-conscious mind is working 24/7. At the moment, our conscious mind is working with the non-conscious mind together. And together, they are taking this information I'm saying, pushing it in the brain, and this whole thing is happening. And the first, the roots grow, which is the words that we're saying. And then the interpretation, how you understand this, grows simultaneously based on other experiences. So we are converting at very high speeds what we experience, what we hear, say, read, etc., into our brain with our minds, with our non-conscious working with our conscious, into the brain, and that causes a reaction, and there's a product that results. And that product is a tree, and that tree is a thought, and the thought is made of branches.
And I thought this was so interesting too, that you say that those thoughts, those physical things, that energy is found in the brain, it's found in the non-conscious, and it's found at a cellular level. Exactly. And that's why it's so literally that, and here's another quote, trauma literally makes you sick. I mean,
well, that's exactly, exactly the point. You're quite right there. Sorry, you were saying something?
No, I was just, I thought that helps. I've read some about the enteric nervous system and all that, and that kind of thing. And I've been trying to educate myself about the gut and the mind's interaction. But this explanation of cellular memory and cellular thoughts, or thoughts stored in the cells, just made so much sense to me, because I see that every day with trauma. I see people physically ill from what they're remembering.
Absolutely. And that's because what they've gone through isn't a nice green tree. What they've gone through is a toxic change in their brain. Right. So there's a toxic tree. So the root system would be the experience of the abuse, whatever the trauma is, and whether it's very complex, whether it's very long established, been a long time, whatever. Trauma comes in, anything that's adverse is trauma, as we know. Mm-hmm. And trauma ranges on a scale of severity, but it looks different in the brain. So it's also an experience, also processed by the mind, also goes into the brain, causes the same reaction, proteins build and hold the data. But the origin is the root, is the origin story. That's the roots of the tree. So there's all the data. That's what happened. That's all the toxic trauma. This is the distorted processing as you're having the trauma. And this is your interpretation of what you had, of what happened to you. And that shows that's built into your brain. It's all distorted proteins, distorted chemicals. So that creates your brain doesn't align with your brain function. And as soon as that happens, not only is it built in the brain, and now we come to the body stuff, but it's also built into the body in a change in our cells. So it's mind to brain to body. And so mind takes it first, and it's like a wave in the brain, like a whole pattern of toxicity in the brain, in the mind. In the brain, it's a tree, a physical tree made of proteins with a root system, which is the origin story, and the branches, which is the interpretation. And then in the body, the memory is in the change in the genes of every cell. And you have 37 to 100 trillion cells. So that's why it goes, and that's why things like EMDR, what they're doing is it's pulling out.
Exactly what I was thinking about. This is EMDR.
It's pulling out from the genes into the data. The brain will bring the data. The mind puts the three together. So the body brings up the physical feeling. The brain then connects that with the data, provides the data, and which is literally the emotions, what happened, the interpretation, and then the mind puts it all together and we feel it as this holistic experience. So we have to use our mind to almost pull that apart. I'm feeling this in my body. I'm feeling this. These are the details. And so you kind of can pull the whole thing apart with your mind to fix it up. So when we talk about trauma, this is creating a toxic response in the brain because the proteins don't fold nicely. This one, the proteins are folding nicely. The roots of this are good. The branches are good. This is a happy memory. This is trauma, and this is terrible. This has created a complete brain damage. And the immune system says, hey, that's threatening survival. So the immune system sends out T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, and we get inflammation, and our homocysteine levels go up and cortisol levels go up. And then on the level of in our body, in our cells, we're going to have a change, for example, in our telomeres. I looked at telomeres in my research, which are the ends of chromosomes, and they're a proxy for how we're managing our mind and our mental health. So if we've got trauma, our telomeres will not be, and undealt with trauma, it will affect our telomeres, which will affect the cells of our body, which make up the organs and the systems. So if it's not like overnight, it's cumulative. So if we cumulatively don't deal with our trauma, that then increases the vulnerability of the entire brain and body to illness by 35 to 98%. So this has to be dealt with. And you can't just chop the head off. Like, if you go into a garden of weeds, you can't just chop the head off. The weeds will grow back. You have to actually read the signals that this is telling you and go from the signal to the interpretation to the processing to the root and deconstruct and reconstruct. And that takes time.
So let's talk about the actual method you talk about in the book, because it has 5 different components of mind management. First, you gather, then you reflect, write, reassess, and there's an active reach, which I preach this to my patients that you've got to do something. You have to take action. But anyway, I would love for you to talk a little bit about each one of those components.
Okay, so those components are not a quick fix, number one. Number 2, they're based on solid theoretical foundation. I developed a theory 38 years ago, and they've been tested clinically and scientifically for 38 years. And I'm constantly updating them. So my most recent clinical trials are in there. So what I try to do is to understand this process that I've spoken about. How does the thought form? And then if it's formed, how can I break it? How can I get rid of it?
How do I get at it where I can begin to reconstruct it?
Exactly. You want to deconstruct and reconstruct, because a lot of therapies, and this with your background training as well, like CBT and those kind of things, are taking that thought, recognizing you need another thought. This is a bad thought. But if you don't deconstruct this, it never goes away. So there's no matter how many gratitude statements, positive affirmations, CBT techniques you do, if you don't actually deal with this and really pull it up by its roots, you're going to be going around the mountain constantly. You're going to go in circles, and that narrative of I'm here, I know what I should do. There's a massive chasm between here's what I was, where I was, and I know why I'm like this, and that's where I want to be, and I know I should be there, and I know what to do, but I can't close the gap. So what I try to do is to understand, how can we put all this together? How can we help a person find these, deconstruct them, reconstruct them? And in that process, I learned that second. I asked that question, and I learned how to do that after I learned how to first build the brain. When I realized, okay, if I'm going to fix up any mess in my brain, if I'm going to do any housekeeping in my brain, I'm going to first have to increase the resilience of the brain, because I saw with my patients that you can't just do trauma work. You can't just do this heavy learning disability work or dementia work or whatever you're doing with a patient. You can't just dive in and do that. It's exhausting. And most of the time, the identities are shot, and they just don't know how to manage their time.
Very demoralized. So
exactly. And the brain is also very limited in energy. And so is the conscious mind. The brain and the conscious mind are very, very limited in energy, whereas the non-conscious mind just never stops. And in the non-conscious mind, which goes 24/7, we have all these, every single experience that we've ever had from a certain point in the womb to the age you're at now, stored as these trees in three versions: tree version, wave version in our mind, and genetic version in our body. So our non-conscious has 3 places where it stores all this information. And then as you, as a conscious person, as you go through life, you draw on it from the body, the brain, and the mind. And that's how you're functioning.
So let me ask you, to people who are listening going, I don't know about this. What about this 90% of my brain function is my non-conscious mind? Can you help people understand that?
Okay, so your brain Absolutely. Your brain is a physical organ. And as I said, if you're dead, it does nothing. The fact that you're alive, you're making this brain respond. So you actually make your brain respond. So that's why we talk about this, the mind being the 90 to 99% factor to make the brain respond. But the mind can't do anything without the brain and the body. So it's a very important relationship between the two. So what it just think of that. Just think of the fact that you're alive and you've got all these changes. You feel the physical changes in your body when you're anxious or worried or whatever. You can
getting older.
All these things, exactly. So we feel that. So that's an example of mind showing up in the brain. The mind shows up in the brain, and the mind is driving the brain. But now with our mind, we have this messy mind and a wise mind. And the messy mind is how we do life. And it's totally okay. We're supposed to be messy because within the messiness, you learn, you grow, you repair, you learn. But we've got this thing with the wellness movement and positive psychology and religion, and that you've just got to be perfect all the time, and that emotions are bad things or toxic or whatever, but they're not. So what we've got to do is shift. And this kind of comes to one of your first questions as well about the mental health movement. And it's not a brain disease that you have. When you're feeling very depressed or anxious or frustrated or whatever, that's your mind. You're feeling that. Your mind is experiencing that. That doesn't mean that you have a brain disease. That means that you are actually, that you can't have depression. Now listen to this very carefully. You cannot have depression. You can have cancer. You can have diabetes, but you cannot have depression because depression is not an it. Depression is an emotional warning signal. It's a messenger filled with information for you to help you. So shift your perspective and say, I don't have clinical depression. I am very depressed because of something or a whole bunch of somethings.
Well, and Oprah has made that point in her new book. What happened to you? You know, it's all about the sum of that experience creating things for you in your cells, in your unconscious mind or non-conscious mind, as you call it. And, you know, I was floored. You said something in the book. I was happily floored because I have said to my patients with anxiety, especially, you know, anxiety is your unconscious, what I called your unconscious mind sending up flares to your conscious mind. It's signaling there's something wrong. Do something about it. And I read your statement, which is very similar to mine. I went, wow, how have we come to the same conclusion? And she's a neuroscientist and I'm a psychologist. So
it's logical. It's totally logical. It's logical because we know we've been so conditioned by the last 40 years teaching that if you don't feel right, there's something wrong with you. You have a disease. And that's why that model, the biomedical model, works for the body and brain physically, but it doesn't work for the mind. What works for the mind is for us to realize that life every day has challenges, which we all know. And every single adverse circumstance is being processed into your brain, your body, and your mind and affecting how you're functioning. So the way you show up is because of something, as we both saying in Oprah's book or whatever, and our instinct. We know that that's not who I am. Now, logically, we know that. But when it comes to diagnosis and treatment, that's thrown out the door. And people simply look at symptoms and they get a label. And initially, I always call it a gift that's empty. So you get this gift and you think, okay, that's the reason why I'm feeling like this. And there's an initial sense of peace. But then it's an empty gift because you open it, now what? And there's all the stigmatizing that comes with it. There's all the limitations. You shift your whole perspective. Your whole brain doesn't work like it should work nor your body, nor your mind, because now your mind has taken this message and has got this toxic view of yourself that there's something wrong with you. I mean, there isn't anything wrong with you. You are amazing because that's the core for you. Are a wise mind, wired for love. We see this in the neuroscience. We talk about psychoneurobiology being literally being wired for love. There's no design in our body to make us crash. The design of our body is to make us function. The design of our mind is for us for survival. So your unconscious mind spends 24/7 helping you survive and working with your physical brain and body to help you survive. AKA, the immune system will work for you and tell you, hey, wake up. Your GI system, your enteric nervous system, all of those are signals, including the emotions, including your behaviors. There's 4 categories of signals that are telling us, that are working for us. Mind, brain, and body produce 4 signals that work for us. And if we know how to tune into them, we can then say, okay, I am showing up in this way because of, and I can then become very analytical, use my wise mind, and start tracking back. There's my pattern. There are the signals. The signals are coming from the tree. Imagine this tree sending out like a little weird, if it's this ugly sulfuric tree and it's sending out sulfuric, whatever analogy you need, or like a volcanic tree and it's sending out a volcanic sort of smoke or lava. Those are the things you want to pay attention to. And I talk about people becoming thought detectives and going
Now say that again. Thought what?
A thought detective. If you
Thought
think
detectors.
Okay. What a detective. You think a detective, what they do. A detective will take a clue and will find out what is the reason why. What does the clues mean? So what are our clues? Our clues are our emotions like depression, anxiety, frustration, irritation, guilt, condemnation, joy, happiness, up and down, 1 minute this, 1 minute that. All of those are messengers. Then our behaviors are another signal. And then so what we're doing, irritable, withdrawn, not sleeping. And then our body, GI symptoms are that's a very common quick one because of the enteric nervous system.
Sure.
Mind, brain, gut that you mentioned earlier on. But on a quantum level, our entire body is being affected. So it doesn't just work through each system. It's also a body-wide thing. And then you look at your perspective. So you've gone from emotions to what am I feeling? Depression. What's my body feeling? GI symptoms. What are my behaviors? Irritable. What are my, and I'm just giving one of each. And what's my perspective? Life sucks. Those are.
Life sucks. That's great.
So there's 4 signals that are coming from something that are showing up in patterns. And your pattern is that you're just like not coping, you're feeling overwhelmed, or like you just whatever it is, whatever the pattern is that's dominant, that's bringing you to therapy or bringing you to a point where you just feel like you can't cope anymore. So you start with a pattern, you go to those 4 signals, and then all the time you're kindly telling yourself, hey, that's not who I am.
Say the 4 signals again, if you don't mind, Caroline, just a second.
It's to look at the emotions.
Emotions, okay.
First on emotions like depression, anxiety,
sadness, melancholy, just whatever, disappointment.
All of it. I have a whole emotional list in the book. And I have a little
I remember that.
Key that you can analyze what level it's on. It just helps people. Then the second category are your behaviors. What are you doing? Mm-hmm. That's different. Are you normally very extrovert and now you're introvert? Are you crying? Normally, everyone cries and crying's good, but maybe you're crying more. That kind of thing. What are your behavior changes in your life that are disrupting you? And so you become very analytical and as you look at those. And the third one is your body symptoms, GI symptoms or heart palpitations or a lot of tension in your shoulders or whatever. And then perspective signals, attitude, mindset. Life sucks.
I think that's one that probably a lot of people don't really look at is that perspective, attitudinal changes or attitudinal issues.
No, what people do, and I've done so much work in this area, is that there's so much psychology out there, and I'm not criticizing psychology. I've done years of psychology too. There's so much stuff on the internet. There's so many words. There's so much mixing up between emotions and depression and clinical depression. There's just so much stuff out there that it becomes very hard for people to, well, where do I start? What do I do? So what I've tried to do is to simplify the process, to say, go from signals, pattern to signal, to the interpretation to the processing to the root. And you use the 5 steps to do that and do it over time, because that's where the neuroscience also comes in. You're not going to do that once or have 1 therapy session or even 30 therapy sessions or 3 years of therapy. If you don't work in proper cycles, you will not rewire your brain. So you will then, what I've seen happening so much in therapies is that carryover is massively ineffective. They're great in therapy, but they don't carry over very well into. It's been a constant.
There's not a generalization of what happens in therapy to their real life. Mm-hmm.
It's real life. The carry over into real life is extremely slow or doesn't happen like it should happen. And it's very frustrating for a patient. So I also try to tackle that. And a lot of that comes from not working in cycles that rewire your brain properly. So if I know what my root is, and I know what I want to be, and I'm starting to work towards that goal, which is a sort of standard practice, and I'm going to reconceptualize it. But if I don't do it properly over the right amount of time, I won't wire this out of my brain. And I won't wire this in, and I won't stabilize it. The other thing is, like, for example, if you do find this and you do rewire, it takes you about 21 days to deconstruct this whole thing, get it out, dig it out, upend this and reconstruct this into something that you can handle, to take this thing out of it. What happened to you never goes away. What happened to you never disappears, but you can change how it plays out in you. So that happened to you, but it doesn't have to stay looking like this. You can make it work like this. You never forget the past, but you change how you respond to it. Still make you sad.
So you must be a true advocate for EMDR.
If anything that works indie on its own won't work. It has to go
neurofeedback.
with neurofeedback, a talk therapy, but in cycles. What I have a problem with is not working. People don't work in the proper neuroscience cycles because they're not trained. If you do EMDR, let me show you. If you do EMDR with someone and you do it for 21 days, let's say 3 weeks, because your brain and body heal in sort of little groups of 3 weeks, you're going to have a patient potentially find the issue. And let's say it's EMDR or talk therapy or psychotherapy, whatever you do, ACT therapy, whatever you do, whatever approach or combination or whatever. And let's say you do get to the root. Can you see that, okay, your relationship issues are coming from the fact that we now see you were abused by X in childhood. You start working through, you start seeing and whatever. By day 21, you'll have a new reconstructed. Look how small it is. Now, this has got to compete with trillions of other memories inside of your head. And this thing is newly uprooted. So it's gone because energy doesn't, once you've done this, you don't have this anymore. You see, cognitive behavior therapy, for example, tries to make this go to that, but you can't. And that's why it doesn't work. You can't have two versions of the same thing coexisting. That's why it's temporary and then it disappears and people go back to the old narrative. That's generally, if you look at the analysis of CBT techniques, I love them, but if they're used in the wrong place, you're going to go back to the old narrative. This is going to regrow. So if you want to avoid this regrowing, you want to use techniques from ACT or CBT, so cognitive behavior therapy techniques. I mention that because it's so commonly used. People can find so much on it on the internet, and so many people know about cognitive behavior therapy and that kind of stuff. It works when you've at step number 5, but let me not confuse the issue. If you've done this work over 3 weeks, you're going to have a new little tree, but it's the size. You can't use this thing's not going to do anything for you. All you're going to have is, I know that's how I want to be. And that's great. That's my new narrative. But it's not strong. So when you're triggered, this is not strong enough to move from the nonconscious mind. It's got to compete with trillions of other memories. So what's going to happen is you still remember this. It's not there again, but you can regrow this just as easy as you got rid of it if you don't make this strong. And that's what happens when people don't go for the proper cycle. So by day 21, you'll have this. Look at the difference. Now we're talking. At day 42, you've got this. So day 21, you've got this. This has got no energy to get enough to make any difference. By day 42, it's nice and big. By day 63, you have this. Look at that big cluster. Once I'm at that stage, I now have a new thought built into my brain, into my body, in my genes, in every cell, and in my mind, that now when I'm triggered, this comes up. This is going to override this past story all the time, because this is now not going to grow back because I now have this. So that takes cycles of 63 days. I've had some patients that have gone 2 years. So that's 14 cycles of 63 days to try and see the root of some level of trauma. So there's no cookie cutter.
Is there some scientific or neuroscientific basis for that 7-day cycle?
It's 21-day cycles. It's not
21, but exponentially.
It was, the 21 has been the number that's been a myth. People say it's 21 days to form a habit. There's no scientific.
You mentioned that in the book.
Very few people who have actually done research on how long it takes to actually rewire the brain, and it's always just been assumed it's 21. So that's what I started testing. There's only honestly about 6 or 7 studies that I could find in the world, and I put them in the book, of anyone looking at the timing involved in actually changing. We all know it takes, and so the average of those studies is around about 65 days, which is 3 cycles of 21. We know that the body, if you get a blister, it takes about 3 weeks, for example, for the stem cells to form and the immune system to do what it's. And then if it's like a bigger injury, you'd have multiple cycles of 3 weeks. So 3 weeks seems to be a key healing cycle. But when it comes to changing a thought pattern,
sure,
you need. What we found was that at day 21, you've got what we call gamma peaks, but you've only got that little tree. It's the patient has gone from, or the subject or person has gone from, I am depression to, I am depressed because of,
right,
and I know where I want to go, and I'm even more depressed now. That's very common.
Exactly. It gets worse before it gets better.
Exactly. Treatment effect. So we saw that, it's called a treatment effect, gamma peaks. We saw that happening at day 21 very, very significantly. So, I saw this in my therapy, but we've tracked it now with it using the QEEG, which, and the psychological measures, blood measures, telomeres, all that kind of thing. And I'll talk quickly about the QEEG in a moment. But when you go further, when you go to day 42, that's when you start seeing, that's another cycle added on. You start seeing another shift. By the time you get to day 63, you're starting to see an actual behavior change. So the timing for a habit to form seems to be closer to 63 days, 9 weeks.
And you know what? The point we have not made is that you really talk about using this mind management technique that you outline in the book, the gather, reflect, write, reassess, and that is what you do for 63 days.
Yes.
That is the minimum, that you do that yourself, spending 5 to 30 minutes a day doing that, or about 5 minutes per,
about 15 to 45 minutes a day. And it's 5 steps that you go through. Each step is very specific. Each step, as you do step 1, you don't want to skip any of the steps. You want to go in that order, because that is how you change the brain. So as you do step 1, different things happen in your brain, mind, and body. Step 2, different things happen. And if you skip, you're not going to take advantage of that. So your brain and body work in a very systematic way. So what you're doing is you're driving your mind in a very systematic way to drive the neuroplasticity of your brain. So that's the science behind it. So when you do the 5 steps, all of them are familiar steps, but they're done in a very specific way.
Yes, they are.
Grouping and the timing of those. And you do those daily. So you do the 5 steps daily for about 15 to 45 minutes for the first 21 days, because that's the real becoming aware, deconstructing, reconstructing. Then for the next 42 days, you spend about 5 minutes a day. You still do the 5 steps, but it's 5 minutes a day. Now, I've got an app as well that goes with the book called Neuro Cycle that people can download from iTunes and Google Play. And that I literally give you therapy. I literally walk you through using audio and video and scripts. And
what is the app entitled again?
It's called Neuro Cycle. So the system I developed. So the 5 simple steps are called the Neuro Cycle. The second part of the book is all about the Neuro Cycle. So the Neuro Cycle is how you do this. How do you find this thing? How do you find those signals? How do you go from the signals to the tree? How do you then break down the tree and find the root? How do you reconstruct the tree into something that's healthy? And how do you grow it into something that's tiny and then becomes big?
I will tell SelfWork listeners, it is not, your book is not an easy read. It's not something that you can sit down and kind of halfway try to understand it, but it is very memorable. And it is something, I mean, I found myself on my walk this morning thinking, about the 5 stages, and you talk about it, you describe it very with so many different facets explained, that I think that it is a very, very, very helpful way to think about it. Where do you think therapy comes in this cycle, this neuro cycle? Where do you think, is it in the reassessment stage, or
therapy, coaching, counseling, 3 different things, as we know, are essential. This is not going to replace it, it's going to enhance it. So in other words, that you think of it this way: you live with yourself 24/7. You see a therapist once a week or twice a week, or your coach, or whatever, or combination. You wake up at night and you're the one having the panic attack. You're not going to phone your therapist at 2 a.m. So you've got to know how to manage your mind. You're using your mind all day long. Your mind never stops. Think of it like this: you can go 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without oxygen, but you don't even go 3 seconds without your mind. So what I'm advocating is to learn to use the neurocycle to manage your mind 24/7. So when you're consciously awake, you're consciously neurocycling all the time, because once you get the hang of it, you can be, it's thinking.
Oh yeah. It's that's what I'm saying. I was thinking about it this morning and realizing, gosh, I know I have that part down, at least the categorization of it.
Yeah. And some people will, then when you're doing specific trauma work, I also recommend, on top of just the moment by moment stuff that happens, like someone sends you an email and throws you, or someone has an argument, you can use the neurocycle to bring you back on track, get the neurochemistry under control, so those 5 steps help get your mind, brain, body back under control, so that you have wisdom and you can function. At the same time, you can allocate, I recommend everyone allocates for the rest of your life, you're going to have traumas that you're dealing with. You're going to have old ones, new ones, the ones that you're currently dealing with. So just allocate a 15-minute block when you're getting ready in the morning and work on one toxic thought for 63 days. And that's where and if you need multiple cycles, do multiple cycles. So often as you're working through a trauma, after 63 days, you realize, okay, that's only that root. There's still this, there's still so much more. So you just keep going. But that way of thinking is a discipline. Here's the argument for it. If you think of it, 63 days time. If you say, I'm too busy, I can't do this, this is too complicated, I can't, fine, you can make that choice. But your mind is then going to stay messy because your mind doesn't stop. Your mind is still working. So if your mind is not managed, if you're just staying in the messy zone and only repairing now and then, that accumulates over time. So what I'm saying is that become disciplined in your mind. The neurocycle is how you can learn to manage your mind. So then 63 days time, you are way more efficient than you were now. And so giving 15 minutes of your day, the first 63 days is always the most difficult. After that, you get into the system. And then the carryover effect into your day and into your life is phenomenal. I've got the scientific evidence. We've got millions of people using this now. And I show that when you do this, you become about 81% more efficient at just managing your mind.
Sure.
So
before we run out of time, because I know you have a plane to catch, literally, you have a plane to catch. There is, and I'm probably going to crucify this word, but it kept coming up in the book. And I thought it was a beautiful, beautiful concept of healing. It's a Japanese term called Kitsugi. Or
yes.
Am I saying that horribly incorrectly?
Kitsugi, yes.
Oh, okay. Can you talk about that? Because I thought that was just a very poignant and meaningful way of thinking about healing.
Yeah, it's beautiful. If you think of life, at the core of who you are, you're amazing, but life happens and messes you up. So the Japanese have a principle that a concept called kintsugi, as you said, and it's if something breaks, like if you have a beautiful vase and it falls to the ground and shatters into 1,000 pieces, everyone else will just kind of sweep it away and toss it. They don't. They will meticulously pick up every single piece and they rebuild it with gold lacquer. So at the end of the day, you have this beautiful new vase with all these gold lines, and that's reconceptualization. So I use that concept for reconceptualization. So here is your life shattered in 1,000 pieces. So instead of just trying to sweep this under the carpet because these are volcanic, they will not go away, I'm saying pick up the pieces and rebuild into something that's beautiful. So all the gold in here is the pain of your story, but it's been shaped differently. It's now beautiful. Your trauma has turned into and it's not that trauma is beautiful, but the way that you've learned to cope, that is what's beautiful. So you're looking at that gold as the life experience, the character. You're honoring what has gone through. And that's what they're really doing. They're honoring the fact that that is a beautiful piece of a beautiful creation. And that because it's shattered, it doesn't mean it's still a beautiful creation.
I love that. That's like it's like your wrinkles. But and because those things, those vulnerabilities, those traumas, they're there. Like you said a few minutes ago, they're not going to go away, but they can be interwoven and into what your life looks like with a great deal of. That's what makes it so beautiful, is that you have all of that is woven together in a really
and we know this instinctively, Margaret, and this is what's interesting is we know this instinctively, but the narrative is saying if you have depression, there's something wrong with you. As soon as that happens, people lose hope, they lose value. Mm-hmm. I want people to know that you are, really, as a scientist, you are wired for love. Literally, everything's about survival. But life messes. How beautiful. It's also okay. It's okay to be a mess. Manage the mess. Be the mess, accept the mess. Yes, I'm depressed. Yes, I'm this. Yes, I'm that. That's okay. I can repair it.
Sure.
I can kintsugi it. I can reconceptualize it. And how
and integrate it into my understanding of myself and my life. Yeah.
Get that. So here what I'm doing is I'm adding a system. I'm adding a scientific system. I always talk about, in summary, like maybe this help people understand. The Neuro Cycle is like Amazon. It's an Amazon for the mind. Amazon is the most phenomenal system that you can deliver anything, anywhere, anytime. It works. That's what the Neuro Cycle does. It is a system that works. You can deliver anything from your mind into your brain, into your body, anywhere at any time. You can deliver stuff in, you can take stuff out. So it's a system for how you can manage your mind. So in terms of therapy, you can do this all day long and do it. And then when you go to therapy, you're more prepared for therapy. You've done the work, you're managing your mind. You take the lessons from therapy and you keep neurocycling through. So it's not that you're doing, it's not replacing, it's making the therapy.
And it gives you a structure to do the work, as you said. So I want to show the book because I'll probably put this on YouTube. So this is the book, Cleaning Up Mental Mess. And I just thoroughly enjoyed talking. I've learned so much from your book, and I'm going to try to use. I am going to use some of your concepts myself, and because I can see how it would work. It makes common sense. It makes emotional sense. It makes rational sense, and it makes perceptive sense. It makes my gut gets it. My, I get it at a lot of levels, at a light or higher level and at a deeper level. So
I love that. It's like what you saying is like it's first course. If you, all I'm doing is do whatever you do, but here's a vehicle, the system that'll make it work more effectively. And there's your level where you can do it on your own, and then you can do it with your therapist. So it's not like it's some other thing to add to. It's how you make things work.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Caroline Leaf. SelfWork listeners, it's cleaning up your mental mess. And she also has an app called Neuro Cycle. And you can use that if you really need or just desire even further help. I so appreciate, and she's got other books too. She's quite the author. So thank you, Caroline, so very much.
Thank you.